Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra. Today, we're going to talk about another interesting book. The book is called Hindutva and Hind Swaraj, History's Forgotten Ideas. I have the author of the book, Dr. Paranjape, Professor Makarand Paranjape. Professor, how are you? How's it going?
Doing well. Actually, the subtitle is History's Forgotten Doubles, not History's Forgotten Ideas, though you might say they are also forgotten ideas in a sense, yes.
Oh, it's very interesting because Amazon actually has given that title to your book.
Exactly. I don't know why. So I told the publishers what's happening, and I think they said they would correct it, but one never knows in today's world. It is a world of misinformation, disinformation. Some of it is weaponized, as you know. So
Yeah.
this book is not just about Savarkar and Gandhi. It's also about how to think, how to understand our past and our present. And so it's really a book about Anvikshiki, uh, I would say interrogative interpretation of events and ideas and individuals, especially very powerful and important individuals such as Mahatma Gandhi and Veer Savarkar.
Yeah, so I don't want to give a lot of bits of the book because I want people to read it and go through the flow, because you have structured it in a very particularly three-part way that I've noticed, and it is based on certain epistemological frameworks. Now I want to stick to the larger narrative around which the book is framed, but as a student of philosophy, it's my duty, it's my moral duty every time, and someone like you would appreciate it, is I think we should start by defining things, like, as per you, as per this book, what are the definitional assumptions that, because you've based it on axioms, right? It's an axiom that you're basing your arguments on. So what is Hindutva? That is question number one. And what is Hind Swaraj? That is question number two. Because, are you sticking just on the Savarkar version of Hindutva? Are you adding Tilak to it? Are you adding other aspects of Hindutva to it? And with Hind Swaraj also, Gandhi started it in a way. Gandhi had people before him, and Hind Swaraj as a concept has gone ahead and even been incorporated in political ways, like, with the amendments to the constitution of Panchayati Raj and stuff like that. So now I'm going to give you as much time as you need to first explain these axioms, so that everybody that's listening to it and who eventually buys the book actually understands where you're coming from.
Thank you. Thank you, Kushalji. Actually, you're absolutely right that I use these two terms both in a more narrow and well defined manner, associating them with the people who were their progenitors, in a manner of speaking. That is, the starting point is Gandhi and his book Hind Swaraj, 1909, and Savarkar and his book India's War of Independence, 1857, also published in 1909. So I'll talk a little bit more about the starting point and these two, I would say, path breaking books, both published in the same year, both banned by the British, and both, in a way, totally, deeply committed to the idea of Swaraj, or independence of India, overthrow of colonial authority, and yet both going about it in a completely different way, right? The means are different, even the ends are different, frankly. This is something we don't fully understand, that the ends of Hindutva and the ends of Swaraj are not identical, though they overlap. They overlap in terms of the political autonomy that we were seeking, but in terms of civilizational and larger goals, there is an overlap again, but there is also an important divergence. So, once again, to answer your question, I start with two specific figures at a specific point in history, and then expand both the idea of Hindutva to include, as you said, other figures, and of course, the idea of Swaraj to me is a mighty concept. It's not a small thing, it's not just political independence. It's actually, Swaraj is actually a theory of life itself. Whereas Hindutva, I don't consider to be that wide in its significance, even though people are trying to actually substitute Hinduism with Hindutva and make Hindutva the tattva of the Hindus. as a kind of defining foundational idea of Indic civilization itself. But I don't think that that holds. It doesn't hold historically. It doesn't hold philosophically, or you mentioned the word philosophically, and most importantly, it doesn't hold politically, because however we want to define it, whichever way we want to, as it were, slice and dice it, Hindutva continues to be identified with a political ideology. And I don't want to elide, I don't want to evade that association entirely. Whereas Swaraj is not identified with any ideology, as far as I know. And it's much bigger even than Gandhi, frankly. It's a Vedic idea. We can talk a little more about it. So I hope that answers your question. But I also want to say one thing which is really important for people who want to read this book and engage with it. That, as I said, it's a way of thinking. It's not just and thinking through history, thinking through ideas. Uh, and it's not just an informative or analytical understanding of two terms or two ideologies. And the main point, Kushalji, which I think is really important for viewers of your podcast and generally, curious GVs. I call myself a curious person, like ourselves, is this that it's very, I would think, it's very debilitating intellectually to identify with any one position completely or feel compelled to do that. It's very debilitating to turn ourselves into Savarkarites or Gandhians or Ambedkarites or Aurobindonians or what have you. And then, in a way, feel compelled or feel driven to go whole hog with a particular position and then start fighting with others on the basis of these ideological monikers or labels. And I think that is happening, Kushalji, now. And my book is about the Hindu Samaj in a broader sense, which is, I think, in need for an understanding which can only come through dialogue. And I'm trying to say that Gandhi and Savarkar are not the so-called original adversaries, as some political groups are trying to make them, though they were ideological as well as political. In fact, even personal adversaries, you might say. Even so, when you step back and you look at their life work, their contribution, then my argument is we need both. By we, I mean Hindus, Hindu society, as well as India. We need both these figures, and we don't need to feel cornered or compelled or pushed into accepting either one of them completely. And that's why I brought in Ambedkar as well, because today there's a lot of talk about blue Hindutva and so forth. And that's a peripheral to my book, but I do touch on it indirectly by saying that the real antinomy, the real antagonism is not between Gandhi and Savarkar, in a manner of speaking, not between Hindutva and Hind Swaraj, but between Swaraj and Jihad. I mean, this is the real antagonism. Though one can argue that Jihad also has a deeper spiritual meaning and so forth. I talk a lot about that in the book, not the spiritual meaning, but its actual practical application and ideological justification when it comes to conquest and what to do with conquered people, how to treat them, jizya and all the rest of it. So a lot of my book is about the conquest of India in the so-called medieval times, and that's why I'm saying that the real threat or the real Shatru Bodh that everybody talks about these days, we used to talk about it long ago, but people awake at the or turn woke, as you like, at their own pace and at their own time. Good, more power to them. But the real threat, the real antinomy, the real, as it were, opposition is not between Hindutva and Hind Swaraj, but between Swaraj as a broader concept, or even Hindutva as a broader concept, and something entirely different, which is your civilizational enemy.
Fair enough. Now I have a few follow-ups over here based on what you've said. Um, On the bit about what is Hinduism and what is Hindutva. Now, Savarkar had a very interesting take. I mean, I'm just looking at it because even Vikram talks about it in his, two-part biology on Savarkar, where he quotes kind of. I'm paraphrasing, so and people are free to correct me if they think I've paraphrased it wrongly. But for Savarkar, Hindutva was a superset, and it was more like a political superset, a societal superset, because in Savarkar's understanding, the Hindu society was, a very different society, especially after the advent of organized monotheism, organized predatory proselytizing monotheism. This is my way of looking at it. And Savarkar and many other thinkers of that time thought that Hinduism at the way, or dharma the way it is, because it is different panths doing their own thing, where unfortunately at times, if one panth gets gobbled up through predatory proselytization, the other panth does not care beyond a certain extent. And Hindutva was that supraset that was non-intrusive, where the supraset beyond a point will not tell you what to do, other than a few major issues like Vedokta Bandi, Roti Bandi, Beti, the no, the seven shackles of Hindu society that Savarkar famously talks about. But he puts Hinduism as the subset of the supraset, because politics had to be converted and intermingled with religion, because that's how Abrahamic religions were. They were political systems that added spirituality to it. We actually had a complete separation of politics and spirituality, where the Shruti and the Smriti were different. But in the case of monotheism, they just put it all together, and they're like, yele kind of a thing, right? Because they don't have a Smriti and a Shruti, they have it together. They have like, if you read the Quran, there are a lot of do's and don'ts in the Quran, while in our case the do's and don'ts are time specific, right? The Smritis can be rejected. So how do we work around with that then?
No, totally. I mean, it's not that I go along with everything you said, but I think it's very important to recognize, as you have rightly pointed out, that Savarkar saw a deep threat to Hindu society, Hindu civilization, and to India. And the threat was not only because of these proselytizing monotheistic Abrahamic religions alone, but superadded to them, to use the super word, was the threat of colonial domination, which had completely ruined us economically, socially, politically, etc., etc. And he was really grappling with how to save these people, these Hindus, divided into so many different sampradayas, as you said, jati, varna, language, region, community, caste. So, how to bring about some sort of political solidarity? That was, I think, his biggest challenge. Now, it is not that Gandhi was completely oblivious of this, but he thought that the inherent power of Sanatan Dharma was so strong that you could make belief and faith a private matter, and yet, under the broader umbrella, of this so-called Sanatan civilization, you could resist colonial authority through Atmabal and to some extent Buddhibal. But Savarkar said this Atmabal cannot be actualized without Bahubal, the strength of arms, and arms literally means guns, armaments, the revolutionary power and fervor which had to come. That's why I don't go back so much to his pamphlet Hindutva 1923, which he revised in 1926. It's a very interesting book, by the way, as a student of literature, of textuality, because it's a work in process. We look at it almost as a settled treatise. It is not. He's exploring things, and I can see, I can see his deep anguish and deep concern for Hindu society, where he's trying to come up with a way to unite us, and to give us a political ideology which can be used to resist both colonial authority and Islamist separatism. And that's why, Kushal, it's very important for us to go back to the Indian War of Independence, 1857, the Indian War of Independence, because there is no Hindutva there in the later form. It's incipient. Why am I saying this? Because at that time he's still envisaging a joint front, a Hindu Muslim front against colonial authority. So, in his heroes of 1857, there are many Muslims, including the so called Bahadur, Shah Zafar, who was hardly a Bahadur. People say he could not even hold up his sword. He was such a weakling. He was well into his 50s and a figurehead. Imagine having a rump or a remnant of Mughal authority as your figurehead. Even if we had one, what kind of India would it have been is a question for us to think about. And he's got all these so called jihadi heroes of 1857. Even one of them, if you read my book, who wanted to destroy Hanuman Gadi. He came from that same area, Barabanki. I mean, actually, he was a South Indian guy from Hyderabad. He became a jihadi, went to the north, and a Ghazi. So he's got these unlikely heroes trying to fight British authority together. And then he changed. He flipped. What happened? And I think you've mentioned what happened. He realized that all these other methods were going to fail. And he probably figured it out as early as 1919, around that time, the Khilafat movement. He was still in Andamans. He was getting the news from here and there. And he felt that Gandhi was a madcap. He even called him that, Marathi. He's got a book about this, sort of chakram kind of person, he said. And of course, he was released, but not only in house arrest. He was released under house arrest to Ratnagiri in 1921, much after, or 22, much after the other prisoners of Andamans, the political prisoners, were released as an outcome of the general amnesty following the end of the World War I, which was 1918. So here's the point, coming back to what you're saying. When you look back at history, you realize that the Congress, in its wisdom or lack thereof, had adopted a approach in which Hinduism and Hindu Tattva, if you want to call it that, though we won't call it Hindutva for the Congressis, was simply the bedrock, was just the ground of Indian civilization. And you see that in Gandhi's Hind Swaraj very clearly, because he talks about the native civilization being the nourishing mother, the matrix. So that's taken for granted. But then, in order to get a unified India, you're willing to go to any extent. That any extent becomes the slippery slope of appeasement, which Savarkar, in his strategic vision, which was much more practical, saw through and then opposed, because he was completely released only in, I think, 1927, and that too by a Congress government, because, a Congress government came to power in Mumbai, in the Bombay presidency, and they released Savarkar, okay, much later, and not the British government. The British government, after all his mercy petitions and on guarantees of not participating in politics, brought him to Ratnagiri. And the Congress government released him. He came to Mumbai. And only in the 30s, when he became the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, that he actually drove a wedge, unfortunately, between the Hindu Mahasabha and the Congress. See, please remember that the Hindu Mahasabha was created actually by Congress people, or people who were aligned with the Congress. Lala Lajpat Rai, Lala Hansraj, there were Arya Samajis, Sir Gangaram, all these people, Munje, Dr. Munje, great man, incredible person whom we don't know much about. An amazing person, a surgeon, a doctor. He started the military schools. Anyhow, he was the president of the Hindu Mahasabha. So, and he was also once upon a time a congressman. And Madan Mohan Malaviya, again, a congressman and a staunch Hindu, a founder of the Hindu Mahasabha. So there was an overlap between all these different factions and political ideologies who were all a part of the Congress. Dr. Hedgewar was also a congressman, as you know. He did a Van Satyagraha and was jailed in the 1930s. But it is only Savarkar who was never a congressman and who really drove a wedge, as I said. And ironically, when all the Congress leaders were in jail and they had resigned because they were in power in the provincial governments under the sort of semi autonomous arrangement with the British, there was a political vacuum. And Savarkar, with his Mahasabha, Hindu Mahasabha, actually aligned with the Muslim League in Bengal, in Punjab, and in the Northwest Frontier Province. So these are the ironies of history. But when we talk about Hindutva, let's not forget that it also came out of Bengal, as most modern ideas came out of Bengal. And Chandranath Basu wrote a book called Hindutva or Hindu Tattva. And that book, I'm told, is now available in English for the first time. It's just come out. I haven't read it yet, but way back, I was one of the few people who traced the origins of Hindutva prior to Savarkar. Okay, so to come back to your point about how Savarkar flips the relationship between Hinduism and Hindutva, making Hinduism a subset of Hindutva, and not the other way around. I don't think people still accept that. Nobody thinks that Hinduism, which is, or Sanatan Dharma, is a subset of Hindutva. Hardly anybody I know will accept that because, as I said, you can't confuse, these two ideas of Hindutva. Hindu Tattva as a epistemological category, which is really broad, okay, which is as broad as Sanatan Dharma, you know, uh, and Hindutva as a political ideology. You can't have it both ways. When it suits you, you say it is nothing other than the tattva behind Hindu-ness. But usually it is, as it were, empowered and propagated as a political ideology. Let's face it, it is political Hinduism that Savarkar is a founding father figure of, not of Hindu Tattva in its widest sense, because Hindu Tattva, as you rightly said, is nothing but Shruti, which constantly reveals itself and then turns into Smriti. Whereas with the Abrahamics, the space for Shruti, is not completely negated, but it's very small and it's very dangerous because anybody who claims to have a direct realization of ultimate reality risks being beheaded or strung up or ostracized or excoriated or called a heretic or burnt at the stake. We know the history of it, right? The room. I mean, look at Quran and Hadith together. They make up the Smriti of Islam, and anybody who comes out of it, like the Baha'is, they're heretics. So, in other words, going back to your distinction, in the Abrahamic traditions, the space for Shruti is very limited. Why do I say it's not negated? Because it is a fact that there are mystics in both the traditions, and no matter how hard you try to stamp them out, they will surface. And even in the Islamic ecumeny, even in Turkey, even in Azerbaijan, people, we don't know about this. There are many Sufi, so to speak, sampradayas or cults. They try to stamp them out, they keep coming back up, and some of them get political as well. So I feel that however much you may say this is the last revelation and stamp out that direct and transformative encounter with the divine or with ultimate reality, it can't be stamped out. And in India, the Sufi silsilas, especially the Chishtiya silsila, are very much alive to this. They're very much alive to this almost Vedantic and self transformative sadhana. And they have actually incorporated Naam Smaran has become zikr, breathing has become, dam. This dama dam mas kalandar means every breath he's in ecstasy. Okay, that's what it means. So the cult of ecstasy, the cult of the Aghori, all of these are still alive, regardless of how much you stamp them out. But as you rightly said, it's usually, I don't want to say only, it's usually in the Sanatan and the Eastern traditions that Shruti is actually more powerful than Smriti. That's why, people stand up every now and then They even give up Vedic authority, adhikaravad. Today we are actually struggling over those ideas. So I think that to come back to your point, I think that political Hinduism is very important, unlike what some of my so-called secularist friends say. And in my book, I talk about how easy it is to be Hindu, but how difficult it is to become a Hindu. Because to become a Hindu means then you have to bear responsibility. You have to bear responsibility for Hindus being attacked in Bangladesh or in Pakistan or in any other part of the world. And you can't wash your hands of them by saying, oh, you know what, that's none of my concern. So I think becoming Hindu in today's world is really important because we are in a competitive environment, as you rightly said, where there are proselytizing, monotheistic, Abrahamic, plus political ideologies like Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which are very anti-Hindu. Let's face it, they're very anti-Sanatani. So if you think that the Hindu tradition, Sanatan Dharma, has something to offer to the world, you know, along with the Cārvākas, along with the Nastics, then you better stand up for it. You better, become a political Hindu also. It's not enough just to be a spiritual Hindu and absolve yourself of all responsibility, to other fellow Hindus all over the world. And in fact, just to wind this up, Kushalji, I would say that that's where Savarkar's Hindutva is also limited. Please, because he goes into the idea of what to do with Sister Nivedita, and he says, oh, she's an exception. And we can't make the exception the rule. So if you're not born a Hindu, it's not enough to, in other words, he wants racial identity, which is not Sanatan Dharma for me. Anybody can be a Hindu. You can be an Icelandic Hindu, you can be a Canadian Hindu, you can be an Australian Hindu, you can be a Russian Hindu, as there are Russian Hindus, ISKCON devotees. There are South American Kashmir Shaivites. There are yoga practitioners. To me, the Sanatan is an invitation, but the moment you make it political, then you'll have to say, oh, there's a racial identity and blah, blah, blah. Do you mean to say Sister Nivedita is not a Hindu or David Frawley is not a Hindu? No. So, therefore, I think that this is an invitation to everyone, and as we progress spiritually, as the world progresses, I guess we will have to invite many more people all over the world to try to become Hindu in the most broad and uplifting sense of the word.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you about the last bit about Savarkar's limiting factor about the Pitrubhumi. Yeah, and it all stems from the Pitrubhumi concept. Uh, I think that's where the Sangh kind of deviated, and the Sangh kind of expanded the boundaries of Hindutva in many ways. And if you notice, where if you meet any senior RSS functionary, there is a very standard line all RSS functionaries use, and I was glad that Sachin Nanda in his biography of Hedgewar, Sachin actually kind of touched upon that concept where the age-old Indian adage "सबको साथ में लेके चलना चाहिए." That's what RSS believes, which is a lot of times people find RSS to be so confusing, where they're like, Arey, how can these two like a person like me, right? RSS would engage with a rank materialist like me, and I am as materialistic as it gets, but they would engage with me and they would try to bring me into the fold also, and then they would go to an Aghori who has nothing to do with me. Like, me and Aghori in a room is not a good idea, because we will not agree on anything, on many matters. So, but they will try to bring that person also. And I think that's where you are right, where Savarkar had a limiting factor. And RSS, I'm not saying the RSS did a good job or a bad job. That is for time to tell. But the RSS did try to solve that problem. Now, one more issue that I wanted to touch upon in terms of a structural issue with our discourse these days. Now, I have read a lot of your books in the past also, your work on Gandhi or other historical figures, and This is not the first
We,
time we're
we, we
on the
did a
pod.
conversation on Vivekananda, if you remember.
Vivekananda also. Yeah. So, like I said, this is not the first podcast we're doing. And we've had multiple conversations, whenever we've met. My biggest issue when we judge historical figures, and this is something, a lot of people are doing this, especially in the age of digital media, on X, on Facebook, on WhatsApp forwards, is this entire um, quote mining business where let's say I don't like Ambedkar, hypothetical scenario, or I don't like Gandhi, I don't like Savarkar. I will pick quotes of that person and I will present those quotes and I will read them. I will give a recitation because that's literally what they said. But what am I supposed to do about it? I'll give my point with an example. Golwalkar is one person जिनके साथ ये बहुत होता है. They quote him from the bunch of thoughts. Now, Golwalkar overrid his own thoughts later on himself. So, which Golwalkar? Which Golwalkar are we talking about? The Golwalkar that disagreed with himself? Like, let's say, in the one thing is that if somebody, went and asked a 18-year-old Kushal Mehra, भाई मेरा 18 साल का जीवन था, मेरा एक्सपीरियंस 18 साल का था, आज मैं 45 वर्ष का हो गया हूं, तो मेरे आयु में भी तो बढ़ोतरी हुई है ना. एंड आई हैव चेंज्ड एज अ ह्यूमन बीइंग, I have changed as a person, my life experiences have changed, my frontal lobe is fully developed now. So which Savarkar are we talking about? Which Gandhi are we talking about? Like the Gandhi in South Africa, the Gandhi who came just after South Africa, or the Gandhi at the end of his life? How do we judge these historical figures on a longitudinal basis? Because nobody wants to do a meta-analysis. That's my problem. So how do you deal with this problem?
Yeah, so this is a very good point, Kushalji, because we are more interested in taking down certain figures today rather than trying to understand them. So the first thing I want to say is that we shouldn't pedestalize any of these figures, and as I said earlier, identify ourselves wholesale with them and try to say, oh, I'm an Ambedkarite, or I'm a Savarkarite, or I'm a Gandhian, or I'm a Bose follower. I think that's very debilitating intellectually. It's suicidal intellectually, if I may use that very extreme form of, as it were, self harm. We have to grow just as these figures grew. Now, Gandhiji was very well aware of it. So he, in fact, gave a nostrum. He said that, all his life he had striven for consistency and truth, but that he had evolved. So people should take his later pronouncements as his closer to his views than the earlier ones if they contradict. So he even gave you the circumstances in which to take the later. And I find such a thread of consistency in him. Now, with Savarkar, it's actually very different. There is a consistency in his commitment, A, to overthrowing British rule through any means possible, but mainly through revolutionary means. He never changed that. Secondly, his commitment to, once again, means and ends. He was a very secretive individual. Okay, he was always, as it were, trying to game the system, work behind the scenes, and he had deep distrust, for the political figures around him, and of course for the British imperial authorities. So none of that changes. And as he grows older, he gets even more, I would say, embittered because he never was a popular figure like Gandhi. But there's a flip, which I already mentioned. With Savarkar, well, the Savarkar of 1909 is very different from the Savarkar of 1923. Now, you can also ask, is the Savarkar of 1966 all that different from the Savarkar of 1923? No, he's not all that different. He's interested in wrecking the British Empire, which he doesn't fully succeed in. And he becomes, I'm sorry to say, he becomes a kind of collaborator. And I'm not talking about the mercy petitions, because anybody would sign these mercy petitions. I would. If you were tortured in Andamans and put in solitary confinement, you would write any kind of letter to get out of that. And nor were the British listening to his mercy petitions. They, as I said, released him only into house arrest and much later. Ashfaqullah Khan, many people signed these letters. I mean, that's not it. But in the 1930s, and later, there was a correspondence between him and the British authorities. And he's actually willing to collaborate with them. Against whom? Against the Congress. So he becomes a wrecker of the Congress. He wants to wreck the Congress party and Gandhi. So for me, it's interesting how many people hated Gandhi. Ambedkar, Savarkar, so many, Jinnah, of course. And so Gandhi, for me, remains a central figure in our whole freedom movement for a variety of reasons. And I think that, we would not have been a democracy, frankly, a long surviving democracy, had it not been for this mass movement. We would have either become a dictatorship, maybe if both had won, because he was all for a dictatorship and authoritarian rule. And even when he was when he was running Calcutta, he had his stormtroopers, so he would not brook any dissent. Just as, today you have these extra, whatever, political armies, and they mete out justice, they settle scores. So, you would have had an authoritarian government, a dictatorship, or you would have had a communist government for sure, because Nehru was already a soft communist. And, the Communist Party of India, they saw freedom only as a transition. They wanted to actually capture power. So all these people wanted to capture power, and so did Savarkar, by the way. So my point is that you're absolutely right in the dangers in quoting people selectively out of context in order to prove a point, because human beings are not factoids. Okay, in fact, there are no facts, and in fact, a lot of my book is actually about history, because Kushalji, people have been oppressed by facts just as they've been oppressed by numbers, right? And earlier, you're a Cārvāka, people were obsessed by religious dogma, by myths, by magical thinking, right? By mantras. You could be oppressed by these things, please. So you have to free the mind of. That's why history, which is supposedly an arrangement of facts, oppresses us, because there are no facts without a context, without a total picture. And in a way, you can even call myself, my book at least, as the revenge of literature against history, or fiction against facts. Because, for me, histories are as fictional texts are historical. You read in my book, Itihas Mimamsa is really a part of the book. So our history wars today are so unfounded. So, apropos your point, the Twitter University, or Google Baba, and weaponized misinformation, disinformation is all about quoting out of context and trying to prove points, and which are completely opposite to what people said. Like for Gandhi, famously, he's quoted as saying that, I don't mind if all Hindus are slaughtered. You should read the entire passage. The entire thing has to be read, and then you realize what he's trying to say. He's basically saying that it can't happen. If you think that you can simply slaughter everybody, you can't, because there's a higher power. And even Hitler, who systematically tried to slaughter all the Jews, failed. So, what Gandhi was saying is, as I interpret him, if Muslims want to systematically slaughter Hindus, they'll fail. You can't do it. And you'll resist them. When you resist them, don't think that resistance is only through arms. That's what he was trying to say. So you quote him out of context, you turn him into an arch villain. It doesn't solve anything, frankly. It just dumbs us down today. What is the way out? There is no simple way out, What is the way out of artificial intelligence, Kushalji? It's real intelligence. Deep cognition is the only antidote to pseudo cognition, isn't it? And today, frankly, we have less reason to do this, though we are doing it more. In other words, with our great resources, including ChatGPT, research has become so much easier. We had to struggle so hard, Kushalji, 30, 40 years ago. किताब मिलना ही इतना मुश्किल था. किताब मिलती ही नहीं थी. कहीं कहीं से ढूंढ के किताब. Every summer I would try to get out of India so that I could sit in a library and read up for the entire year, because we couldn't get books in India. Now you can get practically everything. Everything is available. So there's no reason to be lazy. The complete works of these figures are trawlable, searchable, but we don't want, maybe our brains are being rewired. We don't have the patience to sit down and read a book or to engage deeply. But one reason that, I support your podcast is that, it disallows, or it actually resists, this reductive and simplistic, and I would even say idiotic thinking. Jaldi kisi cheez mein ghus jao, ladai karo without reading. Your podcast actually invites deep cognition. That's why it's so important, frankly. We want everything compressed and we want to know quickly. See, this is why I started the conversation by saying, please do not succumb to the temptation like children. Is he a good man or a bad man? Is he my friend or my enemy? Array, life is not like that. Intellectual history is not like that. It's not about villains and heroes which are easily identifiable by traits, so that the moment a person enters a room, he's a bad person because he's identifiable and stereotyped so easily. So younger people need to resist this kind of programmatic, reductive, thinking which is happening on social media. They need to go to original sources, and that is why in these textbook wars, I'm not at all for top down. Again, NCRT se sare textbooks dobara likhwao. No, instead empower the people to figure it out on their own, and in our examination system allow for them to answer in a more complex way. But it's very difficult because we are going to multiple type questions, and in yes no answers, you're going to be trapped. You're going to be trapped into following the latest political doctrine that is being thrust down your throats, and it's going to make you a very unintelligent nation in the end, unfortunately.
Fair enough. Like, I think touching upon the point on the artificial intelligence bit, actually now we are, in that way, we truly are living in lucky times. Like, so I'll give you an an example. So as I was writing my second book on blasphemy, and there's a very interesting bit as I was tracing the history of Rangila Rasul, and in that bit there is this claim that there were three specific books that Rangila Rasul was a response to, and in one of them, the names, is mentioned by Dr. Ambedkar as a note, like a reference at the bottom of his book, and that's the only thing I could find, and um, I realized how much of history writing is just based on these things, and I just always took it as somebody had read this literature. And when I started digging through the papers, I just realized every road leads to that one citation, which is a citation of like a
Another
subset
citation.
of a supraset. And I I mean, I distinctly remember I was in Canada at that time, calling my publisher, and I was like, "Listen, like, this is the claim, and this is all I can find as a citation. I don't want to lie, so I'm just going to mention it as a passing reference because I just don't like to lie." And the publishers agreed, and we kept it there. But there are many such things that I have noticed in personality analysis, because at the end of the day, history is about, when, like, yeah, like, we see this with translation of text. So every Sunday for my members, we analyze the Rig Veda, and in our Rigvedic analysis also we use three translations, right? We use the latest one by Jameson Brereton, then we use the Griffith and the Wilson one, and then we use the commentary of Shaina also.
May I
And
interrupt? You must use Professor Kashyap's translation. It is available online for free. He's the only one who extended the analysis or the interpretation of the Veda of Sri Aurobindo. That is absolutely crucial. Griffiths is, of course, outdated, very Western. He looks at
yeah.
the Vedas as nature worship. But I don't want to interrupt you, but please include R.L. Kashyap's translation.
Mhm.
closest to I think a breaking interpretation of the Vedas by Sri Aurobindo. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. I'm actually aware of this one too, Kashyap's one. I've actually got access to the Arya Samaj one. The Arya Samaj one to turns it on his head. Like the whole world is going here. Arya Samaj is like, nah, hum to idhar chale bhai. Their whole interpretation is another, and one Maharashtrian one also. But what I noticed is every single translation is a product of its time, is exactly what I was getting at. I was just using this as an analogy, that every single translation is a product of its time. And when you want to do analysis of these texts, it's better to read multiple, because then you have some overlapping areas, and then you can kind of figure it out. And 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 I often talk to, like, look, I'm not a historian, or I'm not an analyst of personalities beyond a point. I and I often request, whether it's you, Vikram, and many others who I talk to, I often tell them that I think we need to start doing meta-analysis of historical personalities. We can come up with a larger, personality gauge, where we can attribute X number of points to X number of things. We can't just say morality has no objective points. We cannot say that anything goes, then murder goes. But then somebody will say, oh, murder in context is fine. I was like, but some context my murder is bad now. So we can create that gauge where is context ka murder ki agar baat ki, तो वो पर्सनालिटी के लिए नेगेटिव पॉइंट आएगा. बट आई डोंट नो व्हाई वी in India, what I've noticed, right, is what worries me about, and this has nothing to do with one government or the other. It's the direction of our society. And then I will take one question from a live viewer, which is a very good question. um this is something that has been worrying me, not from now, from the last 30-40 years since I have been alive. I have noticed this trend. We are, the expansion of what is sacred, or what is, in the pejorative Western term, the holy cow. We keep on adding things to it. It if it starts with, again, I this is my firm belief, and this is my hypothesis. In fact, in my upcoming book of blasphemy, I'm like, ये भी कॉन्सेप्ट बाहर से तुमने अपना लिया और जबरदस्ती का ले लिया है, क्योंकि था तो नहीं. And now we are expanding what is sacred in every aspect of our life. Now politicians are becoming sacred. Historical figures are becoming sacred. कि you can't even have an analysis of a figure. Like, अरे भाई ऐसे कैसे चलेगा? How? आप ये सोचो प्रोफेसर, एक बच्चा आज अगर इसको सुनेगा, एक 18 साल का, 16 साल का बच्चा, if they listen to this and everybody is walking on eggshells. हर आदमी अगर यही सोचता रहेगा कि मैं, अगर आई डू एन एनालिसिस ऑफ अंबेडकर, आई डू एन एनालिसिस ऑफ छत्रपति शिवाजी महाराज, आई डू एन एनालिसिस ऑफ लोकमान्य तिलक, आई डू एन एनालिसिस ऑफ महात्मा गांधी और सावरकर, एंड समबडी गेट्स ऑफेंडेड, या तो वो आके मुझे थप्पड़ मार देगा, या तो मेरे ऊपर कोई केस ठोक देगा. तो हम एनालिसिस कैसे करेंगे? हाउ डू वी लर्न फ्रॉम हिस्टोरिकल फिगर्स देन?
No, this is such an important point. I want to touch on two, three things you said. See, first of all, as a Sanatani, the answer is very simple. Everything is sacred. When everything is sacred, there's no scope for blasphemy in anything, including the Vedas. So, where is this blasphemy? Where is these, attacks for apostasy, heretic? It's basically coming from a political, ideological, dogmatic space. So it comes out of the need to control, to cancel, to shut things down. And this is true of the extreme religious right in the Abrahamic societies you see. Certain religions you can't criticize. You know what happened to a certain spokesperson for what they said, which was based, on Bukhari. You can read what that person was saying, and then there were death threats. So, how many of us can stand up to death threats? It's very difficult. And these are the ironies of history, that somebody who loses an eye for speaking up is so blind, is as blind as a person who's lost both eyes, because they still see Hindutva as an enemy and not that tradition which does not permit any free speech at all. So let's please understand that everything is sacred, so there's no blasphemy at all in the real Sanatani sense. Now, those who have become intolerant, they have weaponized intolerance, and we are living today in an era of competing intolerance by saying, "Arey, if they are intolerant, why can't I be intolerant?" You know, because they are deriving benefits from intolerance, right? So, you talked about this whole Rangila Rasul, case, and there is a Calcutta Quran petition case also that you can look at. And these are political hot potatoes. The British simply washed their hands of it, and they were the ones who allowed this offense, giving offense to other religions. They brought it in and allowed it. And we have continued that you can't give offense. But of course, you can give offense to certain people who don't hit back, like Brahmins. You can offend them as much as you like. You can blame them for everything. You can offend Hindus generally, by and large. You can't, of course, say anything about Shivaji in Maharashtra. You can say anything you like about Gandhi anywhere in India. Nobody's going to stone you because, who's going to defend Gandhi today? So these are our contradictions, and it's very unfortunate, Kushalji, as you said. Now, what to do? Here's what you have to do. The state has to be firm, and the state can't play a double game, as we've done all the time. The left government did not, defend Taslima Nasreen, in Bengal. She was driven out of Bangladesh, then she was driven out of West Bengal as well. So we are cowards in that sense, and the politics of cowardice or of appeasement or of expediency, it's a sliding scale. There's cowardice on one hand, and there's opportunism on the other hand. And yet, to some extent, it is this current government that has protected, to whatever extent possible, the interests of Hindus, whereas earlier governments really did not. And one very important thing you said that I want to come back to. If you go to the sources, if you try to go to the sources, my goodness, you'll see that so many of our settled beliefs are based on zero of flimsy evidence, including the equivalence. Oh, Hindus destroyed other Hindu temples or Buddhists destroyed other temples. You ask for evidence, and it's so flimsy compared to the thousands and thousands of instances of vandalism and destruction from the Christian and the Muslim side. There's any number of those and very few of these, and yet you want to equate the two. How can they be equated? In fact, in my book, there's a whole section called Dakshinayan where I talk about that. You discover India in its navel, in its belly, when you go south and see, what has happened. Not deep south where things were not so bad, but the middle of India, where how the destruction was carried out. So there is a huge, I would say, responsibility on the young to have a healthy degree of skepticism. And I think the one thing that I can take from the Cārvākas is not so much materialism, because you see, matter and energy are interchangeable. So, whether the primary substance of the universe is matter or whether it's consciousness, to me, it doesn't make a big difference, frankly. But the skepticism that the Cārvākas had, deep skepticism about claims of, the afterlife, of the Atma, etc. So I need some of that deep skepticism and also criticism. Modernity is based on criticism. In other words, I have to criticize you, you have to criticize me, Kushalji. Otherwise, how am I going to improve? You're going to find out flaws in my book so that, next time I write, I try to, take care of them. And systems improve only through constructive criticism. And so I've called our insensitivity to criticism, or super sensitivity, I would say. I have called it thin-skinned nationalism in my book. I've said we should not be thick-skinned like our neighbors to the north and the east, where, millions can be killed in cultural revolutions and great leap forward and starvation. And no matter what the world says about human rights and this and that, they don't give a, whatever. They'll do what they have to do. That is, you know, the brutality of power which is impervious to criticism. And then you have some other societies where the moment even you're a supporter, you're positive, you're constructive, like I'm an eternal India optimist, and that's what gives me the right to, within quotes, criticize. Criticize is not alochana, it is samiksha. Anyhow, it is mimamsa, it is reflection. But they're so thin skinned, they don't stand any criticism. And as you said, they cancel you, they jump on you. As you said, koi thappadi maar dega, ya koi aapko, online abuse kar dega, you've been subjected to it, and so on and so forth. So I would say for the young, you have to be neither thick skinned nor too thin skinned. Have a healthy skin so that you interact with your environment, engage with it, and debate, criticism, dissent, and a civilized disagreement is the actually the basis not only of democracy but of civilization itself. And India had it all along. And today, हम लोग इतने संकीर्ण क्यों हो गए हैं that जरा सी बात पे नाराजगी तो छोड़िए, आई मीन एक दूसरे पे टूट पड़ रहे हैं. आई मीन क्या बात है? I don't understand. Where is the civility? It's gone completely.
Yeah, I think social media breeds narcissism, so it's part of it. But I want to ask you this question because it's a good question someone has asked. Where can the origin of Hindutva and Swaraj be traced to? I think Hindutva you've answered. Swaraj is something we would like to hear. And what are the main differences between the approach in life of these two ideologies? Now, for that, I would say, bhai, dekho, second question ke liye, my answer is read the book, especially the 39th chapter, I think is the answer. Hindutva needs Gandhi, secular India Savarkar. I am answering on behalf of the author. I think that the second question, the answer honestly is read chapter 39 of this book. I think that's the answer. And I think the professor will also agree with me that I think in terms of approach to life, I think he's beautifully put it in chapter 39. But on the Swaraj, what are the traces of that according to you?
Yes, I've talked about that in the book as well. And actually, it goes back to the Rig Veda. You were talking about the Rig Veda, where you see many of these concepts that we used in our freedom struggle. Swatantra, we just had Shivaratri. Shiva is Swatantra. He's not Paratantra, you see. It's very profound. Please think about it. We ourselves, if we are Shiva, Shivoham, Shivoham, as Shankaracharya said, we are also Swatantra. So, Paratantra, colonialism. So, what we did is we took these very powerful, these were not just spiritual concepts, these were meta concepts. They were ideas of reality itself. And then we redeployed them in a political environment in the 19th century. So, Swaraj is also a term which has migrated from the Rig Veda, Swarat. Swarat is one who rules over himself, who has, self control is such a, should I say, petty kind of word. Oh, I'm self controlled. No, it's not self controlled. It is, all your senses, all the organs of sense and perception, all the tattvas, if you go back to Sankhya, the mastery of all of them. That makes you Swarat. And then the Vedas are saying the Swarat is the one who can be the Virat. That is, the ruler of the self can be the ruler of the cosmos. That's such a profound idea because, the microcosm and the macrocosm in the Vedic vision were not different. So the liberation of one was the liberation of all because consciousness is all pervasive, right? So please think about it deeply. The idea of Swaraj is embedded very deep in the very roots of human consciousness, of which Sanatan Dharma is a very beautiful and living manifestation and tradition. And we are so lucky to be inheritors of this. It's in our very bones and blood. And not only in ours, in everybody, because the Vedic knowledge is the species knowledge of humanity. It's not knowledge only for Hindus or the so called, you know, Aryas, if you want to use that word, which has been misappropriated again. No, it is a species knowledge of humanity, okay? And all cultures and societies had it. And somewhere it was transmitted orally, somewhere it was written down, but we somehow managed to carry it out, carry it forward, and transmit it till present day. So we are very fortunate. So that's why I said Swaraj is nothing less than that self realization, which also makes you at one with the cosmos. And from a political point of view, I mean, from a civil point of view, not from a political in terms of party politics, though you can apply it there. Please remember, Swaraj teaches you to resist power when that power is trying to crush you, when there is paratantra, where somebody else is आप पे हावी हो रहे हैं. It can even be at home. Someone at home is trying to dominate you. If you know Swaraj, you have to resist that domination. You must be able to do it and be fearless. But it also teaches you self restraint. When you are powerful, you don't have to crush everybody who's weaker than you. So in a way, the Swaraj dynamics is also mental health dynamics. It teaches us to get out of toxic relationships, whether these relationships are at an individual level or at a collective or communal, if you want to go back to the original meaning of communal, which means at the level of the community. And as Hindus, we need to absorb, that spirit of Swaraj, which makes us both fair and fearless and ultimately friendly, because we are friendly to all people and to all creatures, not just human beings. you know Other creatures have a right to live, boss. It's not that they're only for our enjoyment and we have to eat up everybody.
Before we wrap up, I want to read a few bits from the last chapter with your permission. I just thought
Please.
they were beautiful. So, in the last chapter, you say, my method of doing history is obviously not entirely Puranic in Raja Rao's sense. I mean, someone you have quoted before this. Instead, it is dialogical, deploying intermediate hermeneutics, or to use an ancient Indian investigative and critical approach, Anvikshiki. In this specific case, a dialogic form of it. The book is thus an example of Itihasa Mimamsa in the form of a Swaraja Samvad. And we have almost come to its conclusion, which is, let me state it simply and forthrightly as possible. Gandhi's idea of Hindu Swaraj was, let us admit it, a bit of a pipe dream. Its supporting pillars, Hindu Muslim unity, the removal of the caste system, and the restoration of a traditional rural and non industrial civilization in India, have all come a cropper. This is what makes the book Hindu Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, itself somewhat exceptional. This work is far more raw, unfinished, and even idiosyncratic than the settled utterances of his later life. Yet Gandhi was not by any means a young man when he composed it. He was just over 40, in fact. Yet Hindu Swaraj has a childlike candor to it, unvarnished by calculation or guile. I want to read the bit on Savarkar also. Was Savarkar veer or brave? Except for a few arguably motivated critics who accuse him of craven or cringing pleas to the imperial authorities for a commuted prison sentence, no one would cavil that Savarkar did not deserve the epithet veer, or that he was not brave. He certainly was. Not only his actions before or after, but his 10 years in Kalapani in the dreaded cellular jail across the dark waters testify to his courage. Gandhi, we must not forget, also spent some 2,338 days, or close to 6 years and 5 months, in colonial jails, first in South Africa, then in much more lengthy spells in India, though not in conditions as grievous or torturing as Savarkar's. Those who don't believe Gandhi was a Mahatma also don't think he was brave. To me, both men were incredibly brave. In fact, a Mahatma must be brave. As to every brave person or Veer being a Mahatma, that is not necessarily the case. Let us leave this fruitless controversy aside by agreeing that regardless of how true they were to their honorifics, both men were great and made extraordinary contributions to our freedom movement. But comparisons, as they say, are odious. What is more, we need them both. Isn't that the whole point of this book? Here, one thing is for sure, we don't believe in cancel culture. We don't want to play the game of pitting one against the other or canceling one at the expense of the other. I think this was just beautiful, and that's my in my own way on this podcast, I always try to tell people that there are a few non-negotiables for me at a personal level, but beyond that, I always try to tell people that this whole thing of putting Ambedkar in a bracket, or Savarkar in a bracket, or Gandhi in a bracket, these were all people who were they were products of their time, they were products of their own intellectual and social journeys. And like, who can deny Savarkar was a very bitter man at the end of it all. He was a bitter, bitter, bitter man. Ambedkar also became very bitter at the end. But we can learn something from everyone. And I really want to congratulate you. This was a wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I look forward to reading all your future books. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we'll wrap up. So the link to buy this book is there in the description of the podcast, whether you're listening to the audio version or you're watching this on YouTube. Go click the link, buy it. There's a Kindle version too. So if you are a Kindle reader, you can buy the Kindle version. Like, I'm a Kindle reader. So it makes you think. And not only, what this book will make you do, and here's my review of this book. Not only will it make you think about Gandhi and Savarkar, I think it will change your priors of how do you look at historical figures. If you look at the Cārvāka podcast, I've done a couple of monologues of how do we read history or how do we look at historical figures. And I often implore people that have a more nuanced view on these things. You guys are lucky. The professor was right. You guys are living in the age of artificial intelligence where you have those deep search options if you use a paid version, and you can actually create a modular version of looking at, you can tell them to look at this text and look at the figure, and you can give marks and judge actual personalities, which is why I would say have a more open mind. And this is why I love having these kinds of conversations. These conversations do not get the bhadkila views that, let's say, a current affairs topic would get. But if you ask me, something like this gives me way more intellectual satisfaction. And I'm able to do it is because you guys actually support this podcast through the membership program. So this one is especially for all the members of the podcast. So do buy the book, guys and girls. Do buy it. You will love this book. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.